Let me ask something real. When was the last time a single word from someone made your chest tighten, your mind race, or your calm slip for hours or even days? When did someone's silence linger longer than expected, leaving you replaying every gesture, every tone, every pause, as if your inner peace depended on their choices? Most people hand over pieces of themselves in these moments, allowing others to pull at their emotions without even realizing it. The Stoics taught that mastery is not about controlling others. It is about mastering the self, holding the mind steady even when the world is in turmoil. Every thought, every subtle reaction, every twitch of expression communicates more than words ever could. A pause before speaking, a flicker of hope, the tightness in the jaw. These signals are quietly observed by anyone watching. The Stoics called these external impressions, and they warned that letting them govern your inner life is voluntary enslavement. By noticing these impressions without surrendering to them, you reclaim the space between stimulus and response. It is here, in this interval, that choice exists and presence begins. Small acts of restraint create a foundation for calm that cannot be disturbed by the external world. This is not shutting down or hiding from life. It is deliberate engagement, grounded in reason and clarity. To be fully present while remaining unshaken by what you cannot control is the quiet strength the Stoics valued above all. Each moment of observation without reactive surrender teaches the mind that power resides within, and when exercised wisely, even the most chaotic circumstances begin to move differently around you. Presence, restraint, and intentionality become your silent influence, shaping interactions in ways that words alone could never achieve. Every movement of thought, every subtle twitch of expression communicates more than words ever could. A tightening of the jaw, a pause before speaking, the quiet flare of hope in the chest when awaiting a response. These are signals others register, often without conscious awareness. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers are constantly observing, gathering data on what can influence, unsettle, or motivate you. The Stoics called these external impressions, understanding that when allowed unchecked, they govern the mind without consent. Each time we react without awareness, we surrender a piece of control, handing over authority to forces outside ourselves. By pausing, by simply noticing without absorbing, we reclaim a space that cannot be touched by circumstance or the expectations of others. This interval, the gap between stimulus and response, is where choice exists. Presence, calm, and clarity emerge there. The smallest act of restraint signals that our inner life is sovereign. The face we show becomes an instrument, not a mirror. The world begins to adjust to a rhythm determined by our steadiness, not by their provocation. In these quiet moments, influence is cultivated without force, and mastery is exercised without declaration. The elegance of this practice lies in its subtle accumulation. Every unreacted insult, every withheld comment, every deliberate silence contributes to a pattern understood subconsciously by those around you. People adjust their expectations, test less, and recognize, even intuitively, that your responses are no longer predictable. What once provoked frustration or agitation now meets calm observation, and the energy of others begins to flow differently. Relationships, professional interactions, and everyday exchanges transform into arenas where influence operates through presence, not volume. By observing without surrender, by responding only when deliberate, you cultivate a mind that is less contingent on external events and more anchored in internal judgment. Each controlled reaction reinforces self-command, establishing a psychological landscape in which calm is habitual rather than occasional. Stresses that would have once unsettled the mind now pass without taking root, and the individual becomes a stabilizing force even amid chaos. Subtlety becomes authority, and measured attention commands respect without assertion. The Stoics described this as mastery over self, a quiet power that guides interaction and perception without needing to dominate. Over time, this discipline transforms the very way you engage with the world. The individual who governs reactions develops influence that is nearly invisible yet profoundly effective. Others no longer anticipate predictable responses, and leverage through provocation disappears. Timing, tone, and attention are consciously managed, and interactions unfold on your terms rather than being dictated by circumstance. Each pause, each considered response, each moment of deliberate observation reinforces autonomy. Presence itself communicates authority, shaping social dynamics without coercion. The mind that practices this consistently becomes resilient, discerning, and steady, capable of participating fully without surrendering its equilibrium. By mastering the small, quiet moments, you cultivate the foundation of influence that permeates every aspect of life. You become untouchable, not through aggression or volume, but through measured control over the one thing no one else can claim: your inner state. Subscribing is more than a simple click. It is a conscious step toward practicing the same principles, a commitment to cultivating clarity, restraint, and deliberate presence in your own life. By subscribing, you choose to invest in a mindset where calm and reason guide action rather than the chaos outside. It is a personal step toward mastery of the self, toward influence rooted in understanding and discipline, and toward a life led from deliberate presence rather than reflexive reaction. Need is a quiet weight that often goes unnoticed, a subtle pull that shapes choices, attitudes, and perceptions without us realizing it. When you seek approval, recognition, or validation, the mind surrenders a measure of control to external forces. Every expectation placed upon another, every hope pinned to a response, is a tacit admission that someone else holds a key to your peace. The Stoics observed that true tranquility depends on mastering internal priorities rather than relying on outcomes outside oneself. Dependency, even when disguised as simple desire or connection, is the thread that others can tug to influence thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When the mind is conditioned to rely on external affirmation, it becomes pliable, susceptible to the subtle currents of influence that ripple through everyday interactions. By noticing this dynamic, you recognize that control is rarely lost in dramatic confrontations. It is seeded in quiet concessions, in the habitual expectation that someone else must validate your worth or secure your comfort. A single moment of need may feel insignificant, yet the accumulation of these moments forms an invisible tether, binding the spirit to circumstances over which it has no real authority. To reclaim independence, it is necessary first to recognize where these dependencies reside, to observe the repeated patterns of wanting and hoping, and to understand that they are not weaknesses but points of influence quietly claimed by the external world. Acknowledging need as a source of vulnerability allows for a subtle shift in perception. Instead of reacting to scarcity, denial, or absence as if the world has wronged you, you begin to observe these impulses without attachment. The Stoics called this the practice of separating what is within your control from what is not, cultivating a sense of self that is resilient to the fluctuations of circumstance. Each time you notice a desire for attention, affirmation, or reassurance, it becomes an opportunity to exercise choice. Instead of immediately seeking the response that would quiet the mind, you allow the internal state to remain intact, unshaken by absence or delay. This deliberate restraint does not diminish connection. It strengthens it by clarifying the boundaries of influence. The moment when the need is identified and consciously released is also the moment when the mind steps out of the shadow of external leverage. You begin to experience the subtle freedom of knowing that nothing outside your control can dictate inner calm. The recognition of this principle gradually transforms interactions because those around you can no longer exploit unspoken expectations. Silence, stillness, and deliberate self-possession replace the reflexive habits of seeking validation. The release of need also transforms relationships and social dynamics. People may initially respond to this shift with confusion or even resistance because the familiar patterns have changed. When approval is no longer eagerly sought, recognition is no longer anxiously awaited, and reassurance is no longer compulsively requested, the usual levers of influence vanish. Others, accustomed to guiding behavior through subtle cues or overt requests, find themselves unable to direct your attention or manipulate your emotional state. What emerges is a space of genuine agency, a calm authority that is neither demanding nor distant. This does not imply isolation. It implies the cultivation of autonomy, where presence is offered from choice rather than obligation. In social and professional interactions alike, detachment from external validation fosters an inner equilibrium, a quiet confidence that allows for engagement without surrender. The mind that is free from need can participate fully, respond thoughtfully, and maintain perspective even when circumstances are unpredictable. It is a state of alignment in which responses are guided by judgment rather than instinctive dependency, and in this alignment, influence flows from the center of personal authority rather than from the desire to satisfy external expectations. Independence from need also enhances clarity and discernment. When the mind is untethered from external pressures, it can assess situations objectively, prioritize effectively, and make decisions that reflect values rather than impulses. Each moment of autonomy strengthens judgment, reinforcing the understanding that internal resources, reason, awareness, and composure are sufficient to navigate complexity. The Stoics emphasized that contentment is cultivated through mastery over the self, rather than through acquisition or approval from the world. When the habit of non-dependency is practiced consistently, the mind becomes less reactive and more attuned to principles rather than outcomes. The subtle tension of longing diminishes, replaced by the steady knowledge that peace and clarity are available regardless of the external environment. This discipline allows for action that is deliberate, purposeful, and aligned with long-term intentions rather than the shifting preferences of others. By fostering this habit, you establish a resilient baseline from which engagement is neither desperate nor defensive, but informed, balanced, and self-directed. There is also a profound psychological impact in observing how liberation from need reshapes desire itself. When approval or validation is no longer pursued compulsively, desires can be examined, refined, and redirected toward intrinsic goals rather than fleeting gratifications. What once felt urgent or indispensable is experienced instead with equanimity, allowing for reflection on its true significance and value. This reframing cultivates a disciplined desire that seeks growth, understanding, and fulfillment within the self, rather than in the fleeting responses of others. Each act of releasing need is an exercise in self-sovereignty, reinforcing the principle that external contingencies do not dictate inner experience. Over time, the mind begins to anticipate engagement from a place of sufficiency rather than deficiency. When interactions unfold, they are approached with calm intentionality, and the influence of others is experienced as incidental rather than determinative. The subtle power in this practice lies not in control over the external world, but in mastery over the internal one, where dependency once held sway. Even subtle dependencies can erode self-possession over time, so consistent attention to need is essential. Each moment of longing, hope, or expectation presents an opportunity to practice observation and deliberate release. By cultivating awareness of these impulses and choosing not to act on them reflexively, the mind develops resilience, patience, and clarity. The practice is neither punitive nor harsh. It is the careful tending of inner life, like pruning branches to allow a tree to grow straight and strong. The result is not detachment in the sense of coldness or disconnection, but a disciplined engagement with the world that preserves autonomy while allowing genuine presence. Through repeated practice, the individual learns to respond from a place of calm sufficiency rather than reactive need, transforming ordinary interactions into exercises in thoughtful presence and mindful influence. In this process, the mind also develops a heightened sensitivity to the distinction between genuine value and transient expectation. Recognition, affirmation, and reassurance are no longer taken as measures of worth. They are perceived as external circumstances with limited bearing on internal equilibrium. By disentangling self-perception from external feedback, the individual cultivates an unshakable base from which engagement is deliberate and influence is subtle but pervasive. This is the essence of self-governance, the freedom to participate fully in life without surrendering authority over the inner experience. The Stoics emphasized that contentment and resilience are cultivated internally, and the consistent practice of releasing need is a practical embodiment of that teaching. Each instance of deliberate non-dependency reinforces the understanding that peace is cultivated from within and that true freedom arises when the mind is no longer subject to the imperatives of external desire or expectation. Through these practices, autonomy becomes habitual. The mind, trained to release need, develops an internal landscape that is stable, resourceful, and capable of sustaining engagement in any circumstance. Interaction becomes a choice, attention becomes intentional, and influence arises not from coercion, but from presence and equanimity. What was once a source of vulnerability transforms into a subtle foundation of power, quiet yet undeniable. By cultivating this discipline, each encounter, each conversation, and each expectation is met with clarity and presence, reinforcing the Stoic principle that the mind is sovereign, resilient, and unshaken, regardless of the external world. Freedom from need is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical state of being, realized through repeated attention, reflection, and deliberate engagement, establishing a life defined by calm authority and deliberate presence. Silence carries a weight that most fail to notice, not because it is empty, but because it is full of possibility. It is the quiet space where thought, observation, and restraint converge, creating a presence that is felt without being announced. The world often misinterprets silence as uncertainty, as weakness, or as indecision, and in that misreading lies its subtle power. Most people rush to fill gaps in conversation, to respond before reflection, to assert presence through volume or immediate action. In doing so, they surrender control, allowing momentum to shift toward the loudest or most impulsive, handing over influence without realizing it. But when you pause deliberately, when you allow the interval to exist and breathe, you establish a rhythm not dictated by others, and in that measured stillness, the dynamics of engagement quietly begin to shift. The silence does not command with force. It commands by presence, and presence, when it is calm and unwavering, communicates authority more effectively than speech ever could. It is a subtle language, understood instinctively by those attuned to patterns of response, and it requires no drama, no overt display, only disciplined attention and observation. By choosing silence, you create a reflective mirror in which others reveal themselves, often more fully than they intend. Their words stretch to fill the empty space, their gestures become amplified, and their anxieties or intentions emerge almost unbidden. In those moments, every over-explained justification, every hurried clarification, every unconscious reveal becomes a source of insight, a guide to understanding where leverage has previously existed. The Stoics referred to this practice as assent to impressions with judgment, observing that the mind is sovereign only when it decides which external signals to accept and which to let pass. Silence allows you to receive impressions without granting them automatic authority over your state. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. By holding this space, you become the still center in a world of motion, the point of stability around which others orient themselves. The pause, when wielded with intention, becomes a subtle but profound form of influence, shaping interactions not by overt action, but by the quiet power of measured inaction. It demonstrates that the mind can be present without being compelled, observant without being drawn into reactive currents. The strategic nature of silence becomes increasingly clear in social and professional contexts. When a point is made, a challenge posed, or a confrontation begins, the immediate impulse is to defend, to justify, or to assert. Yet the momentary restraint, the calm interval before speaking, changes everything. The other party begins to interpret the lack of response through their own expectations, often filling it with anxiety or second-guessing. Their attempts to provoke a reaction or elicit affirmation expand, sometimes revealing motives, intentions, or weaknesses that would have remained hidden had the silence not been maintained. Each measured pause becomes a lens through which the world is refracted, revealing subtleties that are otherwise invisible in the rush of conversation. By learning to hold this silence without compulsion, you create a psychological environment in which control is not seized, but naturally emerges from the clarity of your presence. Timing, in these moments, is not incidental. It is a quiet assertion of influence, a demonstration that your inner rhythm is your own, untouched by external pressures. This approach also cultivates patience, the kind that is disciplined rather than passive. Silence practiced as a tool of observation requires a steady mind, able to withstand discomfort, uncertainty, or even tension without being swayed. The impulse to fill the void, to speak first, to assert, is gradually diminished as the benefits of measured restraint become apparent. The mind grows attuned to the subtle cadence of interaction, noticing the ebb and flow of intent, emotion, and expectation. Each instance of deliberate silence reinforces an understanding that response is a choice, and that the timing of that response determines not just the immediate outcome, but the psychological dynamics that follow. The Stoics emphasized that the interval between stimulus and response is sacred, a space in which rational thought, self-command, and discernment can be exercised. Silence is the vessel in which these qualities are realized, a container that holds both reflection and subtle influence simultaneously. Even the smallest instances of maintained silence accumulate into a broader sense of authority and presence. The mind learns that not every prompt, expectation, or provocation requires engagement, and that restraint produces clarity that immediate reaction cannot. Over time, habitual silence fosters a space in which decision-making is deliberate, awareness is heightened, and interactions are guided by principle rather than compulsion. The unobserved observer gradually becomes a force in the environment, demonstrating that influence and composure are inseparable from the ability to hold space for reflection. The Stoics recognized that power is less about exertion and more about presence, less about noise and more about steady equilibrium. Silence, in its deliberate practice, is the embodiment of this principle, allowing the individual to navigate the currents of life with intentionality and poise. Ultimately, the practice of silence reshapes the understanding of control itself. The individual who observes without immediate reaction establishes a psychological foothold in any interaction. Timing, attention, and perception become the instruments through which influence is exerted. By holding space, one allows the external world to reveal itself while preserving sovereignty over the inner state. Each instance of measured restraint strengthens a pattern of self-mastery in which calm is habitual, clarity is cultivated, and influence emerges naturally. The mind that masters silence transforms ordinary interactions into exercises in strategic presence, turning potential vulnerability into subtle strength. The rhythm of engagement is no longer dictated by external expectations. It is guided by deliberate choice, anchored in reason, and sustained by disciplined observation. In this stillness, authority is realized quietly but unmistakably, forming the foundation for deeper composure and unwavering presence. Introducing deliberate variance requires a mindful approach, not randomness. It is not the creation of chaos nor a rejection of consistency, but a disciplined practice of flexibility and unpredictability within the bounds of principle. The Stoics advised being like the river, consistent in essence, yet fluid in form. Your values, intentions, and priorities remain stable, yet the ways in which you express them, the timing of your actions, and the rhythm of your responses are intentionally varied. Sometimes you respond immediately, sometimes you allow a pause, sometimes warmth is extended openly, and other times your reserve is maintained. Each instance of conscious variance subtly disrupts the patterns others rely upon, forcing them to recalibrate, to reassess, and to approach you with caution rather than assumption. As Epictetus observed, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This unpredictability is a protective mechanism, preserving mental space and sovereignty. It communicates that while you are engaged, present, and consistent in principle, you are not a predictable instrument to be played. By becoming unreadable, you shield yourself from undue influence and establish a quiet authority that does not need to be announced. The very act of controlling predictability becomes an exercise in self-mastery, reflecting the Stoic belief that freedom and power arise from the governance of one's own mind and actions, rather than from the manipulation of external circumstances. Deliberate variation also reshapes internal perception. By consistently resisting the pull of predictable response, the mind becomes less reactive, more measured, and increasingly capable of observing its own impulses without immediate surrender. This self-awareness is at the heart of Stoic discipline, to act from reason rather than compulsion, to allow patterns of thought and behavior to be informed by principle rather than habit. The individual learns to discern which impulses are worth expression and which are better held in reserve. In doing so, mental and emotional energy is preserved and interactions gain depth and intentionality. The simple act of introducing subtle unpredictability cultivates a landscape of observation, reflection, and choice, reinforcing both inner autonomy and outward influence. Each measured variation compounds over time, building a reputation of steadiness and discernment while maintaining the flexibility that prevents exploitation. The protective and influential aspects of pattern disruption are inseparable. By becoming less predictable, the individual safeguards against manipulation, while simultaneously establishing a presence that commands attention and respect. Observers are forced to engage with substance rather than assumption, to recognize the thoughtfulness underpinning behavior rather than relying on reflexive expectation. This quiet mastery is both defensive and generative. It shields the mind from undue influence, and it fosters an environment in which interactions are more deliberate, considered, and principled. The Stoics emphasized the cultivation of self-governance as the cornerstone of freedom, and deliberate variation in behavior is a practical application of this principle, ensuring that the mind is neither enslaved to habit nor vulnerable to exploitation. Presence becomes a tool of influence, subtle but undeniable, emerging from the consistent application of intentional unpredictability. Over time, the practice transforms social dynamics and self-perception. The mind that governs its own patterns develops confidence, resilience, and clarity. Engagement becomes deliberate, interaction intentional, and influence arises naturally from the perception of careful, thoughtful behavior, rather than from coercion or force. Predictability, once a leash, is replaced by autonomy. Control, once ceded to expectation, is reclaimed through subtlety and awareness. Each conscious decision to vary response reinforces self-mastery and the quiet power that emerges from disciplined presence. The individual moves through life with steady influence, navigating relationships and interactions with thoughtful adaptability, maintaining composure and shaping outcomes through the deliberate management of patterns. Respect grows not from volume or force, but from the unmistakable stability and intentionality of behavior. In mastering patterns and introducing conscious variance, the mind asserts its sovereignty, cultivates resilience, and transforms ordinary interaction into a landscape of subtle authority, demonstrating that true influence and freedom emerge from disciplined, intentional engagement rather than from reactive predictability. Attention is one of the subtlest forms of influence, yet it is also one of the most powerful because it carries both energy and presence wherever it goes. Every glance, every listening ear, every moment of focus conveys value beyond words, signaling importance and shaping perception in ways often overlooked. Yet in the modern rhythm of constant connectivity and perpetual engagement, attention is squandered, scattered across distractions, obligations, and incessant social demands. The mind becomes a conduit for external stimuli, flowing freely without discernment, and in doing so, the individual diminishes the implicit weight of presence. The Stoics understood that what is given too freely loses its significance, and that the power of attention, like any finite resource, is magnified when it is deliberate, measured, and thoughtfully directed. The more attention is assumed, expected, or unconsciously distributed, the less it signals. The act of being present without restraint becomes commonplace, predictable, and easily taken for granted, while the true potency of influence lies in intentionality, in knowing when to engage and when to withdraw. Each moment in which attention is consciously withheld becomes an assertion of autonomy, an affirmation that your energy and presence are not obligations, but choices. This deliberate calibration of focus transforms ordinary engagement into an instrument of subtle authority, in which the unspoken communication of value far outweighs overt demonstration. When availability is treated as infinite, it communicates a vulnerability few recognize. By responding instantly to every message, attending every call, and yielding to every expectation, a subtle dependency forms. The environment begins to assume that your presence is continuous, your attention guaranteed. This assumption weakens influence because it removes discretion, the very factor that transforms engagement into significance. When you step back, when moments of attention are intentionally measured, scarcity imbues presence with weight. Others notice the difference without consciously articulating it. They adjust their own behaviors to align with this new rhythm, responding with heightened consideration, greater thoughtfulness, and a renewed awareness of what was once taken for granted. The mind, trained to honor the finite nature of focus, begins to operate strategically, allocating energy to interactions, decisions, and engagements that align with principle rather than compulsion. The withdrawal of attention is not a withdrawal from life or connection, but a disciplined act that reestablishes boundaries, preserves clarity, and elevates the value of participation. Through this practice, presence is no longer an undifferentiated constant. It becomes a tool of influence and an anchor for personal sovereignty. The psychological dynamics of attention are subtle yet profound. Human perception responds instinctively to scarcity. The rare is noticed, the constant fades into the background. When attention is abundant and freely given, it ceases to convey distinct meaning. But when attention is calibrated, measured, and aligned with intention, it commands consideration without demand. The Stoics emphasized that external conditions should not dictate internal equilibrium, and this principle extends directly to how presence is offered. By consciously controlling the flow of attention, the mind becomes a stabilizing force, capable of guiding interactions without manipulation or coercion. Each selective moment of engagement signals value and encourages respect, not through assertion of authority, but through the quiet clarity of intentionality. This subtlety is the essence of disciplined influence, The mind that measures its presence, that conserves attention, becomes inherently compelling. Others respond to the conscious rhythm established, not because they are forced, but because the patterns they once relied upon no longer hold, and the scarcity of deliberate focus creates a natural pull toward consideration and awareness. Even ordinary interactions are transformed when attention is treated as a finite and meaningful resource. Casual conversations, professional meetings, and everyday encounters take on heightened significance when engagement is intentional. By calibrating presence, the mind preserves cognitive and emotional energy, focusing it where it is most valuable while allowing peripheral interactions to occur without overinvestment. The impact of this practice accumulates over time. The individual becomes recognized as deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. Presence itself communicates competence, authority, and emotional intelligence, even without overt declaration. When others notice that their attempts to command attention are met with measured availability, a subtle psychological shift occurs. Expectation is disrupted, assumptions are challenged, and interactions are guided by a newfound equilibrium. This practice cultivates both autonomy and influence simultaneously, reflecting the Stoic principle that mastery of the self produces mastery over circumstances, not through dominance, but through strategic engagement and disciplined presence. Attention, when withheld strategically, also cultivates discernment. Each pause, each delayed response, and each moment of quiet observation allows the mind to assess the situation without the pressure of immediate engagement. The Stoics taught that clarity of judgment is best achieved in a calm and deliberate state, free from the impulsive pull of emotion or compulsion. By treating attention as a resource rather than a reflex, the mind develops an enhanced capacity to prioritize, to allocate energy where it is most impactful, and to act with precision rather than habit. This approach cultivates internal resilience. The mind becomes less reactive to provocation, more capable of measured response, and increasingly adept at navigating social and environmental dynamics. The deliberate management of attention is not withdrawal in the sense of disengagement. It is a disciplined calibration that magnifies influence, reinforces autonomy, and maintains equilibrium. In each instance, the mind exercises sovereignty over focus, subtly shaping outcomes without overt exertion, and establishing patterns of interaction that are sustainable, deliberate, and strategically advantageous. The effect extends beyond immediate interactions into broader patterns of personal conduct. By consistently regulating the availability of attention, the individual cultivates an inner framework of self-governance, where priorities are respected, energy is preserved, and influence is exercised without overt effort. Others adapt to this presence, learning to value engagement, and the pattern of interaction evolves naturally. The perception of intentionality communicates reliability, thoughtfulness, and deliberate judgment. Over time, the accumulation of these moments establishes a reputation for measured engagement, where the mind's focus is recognized as a resource that commands consideration rather than being assumed. This subtle authority, cultivated through disciplined management of attention, demonstrates that power is not created through volume or coercion, but through strategic presence, deliberate allocation of energy, and the quiet assertion of autonomy. It reflects the Stoic understanding that the mind governs experience, and that influence derives from composure, clarity, and conscious participation. The practice also reveals the relationship between attention and self-worth. When the mind treats its focus as a resource to be allocated with intention, it reinforces a sense of value and agency. Others' demands no longer dictate the tempo or quality of engagement. Internal standards replace external pressure, and the individual's sense of importance is grounded in discipline rather than approval. This creates a psychological resilience that supports thoughtful action across diverse circumstances, from professional collaboration to personal relationships. The Stoics emphasized that self-governance and inner contentment are cultivated through mastery over perception and intention rather than through the accumulation of external validation. By treating attention as finite and deliberate, the individual embodies this principle in daily practice, reinforcing autonomy while fostering respect naturally without assertion or coercion. Over time, the cumulative effect of measured attention shapes both the individual and their environment. Each conscious pause, each deliberate moment of presence, reinforces a pattern of interaction in which engagement is meaningful, influence is subtle yet powerful, and autonomy is maintained. The individual's inner life remains unshaken by external demand, while the external world adjusts to the clarity, consistency, and deliberation of their presence. The mind becomes a stabilizing force in the midst of distraction, a quiet authority recognized and respected by those who perceive it. Scarcity of attention, when applied thoughtfully, transforms ordinary interactions into arenas of intentional influence, reinforcing the Stoic principle that mastery of self is the foundation for mastery of circumstances. Presence, when measured, communicates power without words, authority without assertion, and influence without demand, creating a life in which every engagement is guided by deliberate choice and disciplined awareness. The understanding of attention as currency is thus both protective and generative. It shields the mind from the erosion of constant availability, preserves energy for what truly matters, and cultivates subtle, natural influence in interactions. By exercising restraint, the mind communicates value through its own comportment rather than through external signals. Each interaction becomes a reflection of internal sovereignty, a demonstration of deliberate presence, and a testament to the efficacy of disciplined attention. Over time, these repeated acts cultivate an environment in which respect is earned, influence is observed, and engagement is intentionally weighted, reflecting the Stoic principle that internal mastery produces external coherence. Presence, when offered intentionally, becomes more than mere participation. It becomes a channel of influence, a vehicle of authority, and a foundation for measured, thoughtful, and unshakable engagement with the world. Through the conscious allocation of attention, autonomy, presence, and influence are strengthened simultaneously. Each interaction is an opportunity to reinforce the sovereignty of the mind, to preserve clarity, and to communicate value without assertion or demand. The disciplined use of attention ensures that engagement is deliberate, influence arises organically, and the individual remains unshaken by external pressures. By treating attention as a finite, purposeful resource, the mind cultivates both personal resilience and subtle authority, aligning with the Stoic principle that true power emerges from mastery over one's own focus, choices, and presence, rather than from the uncontrolled expectations of others. In this practice, attention becomes a tool, a shield, and a currency of influence, demonstrating that calm, deliberate, and intentional engagement transforms ordinary interaction into a landscape of quiet yet profound authority. Immediate reactions carry an illusion of power. The swift response is often mistaken for decisiveness, yet it frequently betrays an attachment to the moment, a dependence on events unfolding exactly as they arrive. Acting first signals that the mind is tethered to stimuli, swayed by their urgency rather than governed by deliberate intent. The Stoics recognized the danger in this reflexive engagement, emphasizing the space between stimulus and response as the true domain of choice. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. It is in that interval that reason can intervene, shaping action according to principle rather than impulse, and guiding conduct with measured attention. By introducing a deliberate pause, by resisting the compulsion to answer immediately, the individual asserts a quiet authority, shifting the rhythm of interaction away from external pressures and toward internal mastery." Each breath taken before a response is a subtle recalibration of influence, signaling that the mind is not hurried, that it is not compelled by the immediacy of circumstance, and that the flow of events does not dictate the flow of thought. In that stillness, clarity emerges, and the power of deliberate timing replaces the illusion of hasty force. The effect of delayed response is both psychological and relational. When others encounter the restraint of measured timing, their expectations are disrupted. The urgency that once drove interaction shifts, subtly repositioning control. In conversations where provocation is intended to elicit immediate reaction, the pause denies the expected leverage, and the instigator is forced to confront uncertainty. Their assumptions about predictability no longer hold, and the pause itself becomes a silent demonstration of presence and discipline. The Stoics viewed such restraint as an exercise in self-command, where autonomy is exercised not through confrontation or force, but through the careful orchestration of one's own responses. Each moment of hesitation, each choice to reflect before acting, establishes a rhythm in which influence flows from deliberate action rather than reaction, and the individual becomes a stabilizing force, capable of directing the emotional tone of interaction without engaging in unnecessary conflict. It is a quiet mastery that communicates authority subtly yet unmistakably, shaping the environment without coercion. Pausing before action also deepens awareness. When the immediate urge to respond is restrained, the mind gains space to assess the situation, evaluate the motives of others, and consider the long-term consequences of words and deeds. This space transforms interaction from a reactive exchange into a thoughtful negotiation of presence and intention. The Stoics referred to this as discerning what is within one's control and what is not, recognizing that clarity emerges when the mind refuses to be rushed by external events. Every delayed response becomes a deliberate choice, reinforcing the internal structure of decision-making. By consistently practicing this restraint, the mind develops a heightened capacity for judgment, able to discern nuance and maintain composure in situations that would otherwise provoke impulsive or emotionally driven action. The pause transforms perception, allowing the individual to engage with precision, intentionality, and awareness, rather than being carried along by external pressure. The transformative power of timing extends beyond immediate exchanges. By controlling when a response is delivered, the individual governs not only the tone, but the emotional trajectory of an interaction. Urgency, agitation, or expectation that once defined the pace of exchange is redirected. The other party, accustomed to instant feedback, experiences the absence of automatic reaction as a subtle recalibration of influence. In this adjustment, control shifts naturally, not through confrontation or force, but through the disciplined management of temporal dynamics. The mind, freed from the tyranny of reflexive engagement, maintains equilibrium, while the external world aligns, often unconsciously, to the measured pace set by deliberate choice. The rhythm of interaction, once dictated by external stimulus, is now informed by the individual's judgment, allowing engagement to occur under the terms of reasoned thought rather than instinctive compulsion. This approach also reinforces emotional resilience. Reacting immediately binds the mind to the fluctuations of circumstance, amplifying the effect of provocation and extending the influence of others over one's internal state. By delaying response, the individual exercises agency over the emotional impact of events, creating a buffer between external stimulus and internal experience. The pause allows for reflection, the tempering of impulse, and the application of principle to action. In this space, the mind experiences freedom from the automaticity of reaction, establishing a consistent baseline of composure. The Stoics taught that serenity is cultivated through mastery over perception and action, not through avoidance or suppression. Each intentional delay strengthens the capacity for calm, measured engagement, creating an enduring foundation of self-governance that influences behavior across contexts, relationships, and challenges. Over time, the habitual practice of measured response transforms habitual patterns of thought and behavior. The individual learns to observe impulses without being compelled to act upon them, to distinguish between what demands immediate attention and what benefits from reflection, and to cultivate patience as a tool of strategic influence. Deliberate timing becomes a vehicle for presence, a method of shaping outcomes through careful orchestration rather than force. The psychological weight of immediate provocation diminishes, replaced by a measured engagement in which responses are guided by clarity and principle. Those who encounter this disciplined approach to timing recognize, consciously or unconsciously, the shift in control. Influence is no longer granted to those who can provoke quick reaction, but to the individual who governs the tempo of interaction with deliberation and insight. This discipline also fosters internal clarity and strengthens judgment. Each pause allows the mind to prioritize reasoning over reflex, to evaluate context, intention, and consequence before committing energy to action. The practice builds discernment, revealing which exchanges merit attention and which can be navigated with restraint. By exercising control over timing, the individual preserves cognitive and emotional resources, avoiding the depletion caused by reactive engagement. Presence becomes intentional, and each interaction is guided by principle rather than compulsion. This disciplined approach reinforces autonomy, allowing influence to emerge from deliberate action and the careful calibration of engagement rather than from urgency or external pressure. The Stoics valued such control, recognizing that the interval between stimulus and response is where freedom and choice reside. Delaying response also strengthens subtle authority. The mind that governs its timing exerts influence without overt assertion. The external world, accustomed to immediate compliance or reaction, must adjust to a new rhythm. Expectations are recalibrated, assumptions tested, and the psychological balance of interactions subtly shifts. By maintaining a deliberate interval before response, the individual becomes a stabilizing presence, capable of directing emotional currents, managing perception, and guiding the flow of dialogue. This measured authority is recognized not through declaration, but through consistent practice, and it transforms ordinary engagement into a demonstration of disciplined influence. Timing, once overlooked, becomes a medium of mastery, shaping outcomes and perceptions with precision and calm. The implications extend across professional, social, and personal dimensions. Immediate reactions often compound misunderstanding, escalate tension, and create unnecessary vulnerability. By introducing deliberate pause, each interaction is approached with thoughtful consideration. Negotiations are conducted with strategic clarity. Conflicts are navigated with tempered judgment, and communication becomes an instrument of calm influence. The rhythm of engagement is consciously managed, and the individual's presence carries weight without overt assertion. Authority emerges from the measured interval, from the careful calibration of timing, and from the consistent exercise of judgment. Influence is therefore grounded in reasoned restraint, and the mind maintains sovereignty over both internal and external currents. Ultimately, the disciplined use of pause is a form of self-governance that manifests in every interaction. Each delayed response reinforces composure, cultivates autonomy, and strengthens the ability to engage from a position of clarity rather than reflex. The mind that exercises restraint in timing becomes a center of quiet authority, shaping perception, guiding interaction, and preserving internal equilibrium. The Stoics emphasized that mastery of the self is the foundation for mastery over circumstance, and deliberate response embodies this principle in action. Timing, once overlooked, becomes the instrument through which influence, presence, and authority are exercised, creating a life in which actions are guided by principle, Reflections are informed by reason, and engagement occurs on terms determined by choice rather than compulsion. Remember this: true strength is quiet, calm, and unshakable. It lives in the mind that observes without surrender, acts without attachment, and holds presence as a choice rather than a reaction. Every moment you step into that space, you reclaim a piece of freedom that no one can take from you. You are no longer moved without consent, no longer manipulated, and no longer caught off guard. Carry this clarity forward, and let your presence shape the world around you with deliberate calm. If you want to deepen this practice, click on one of the suggested videos on the screen and continue exploring the principles that strengthen inner mastery and Stoic presence. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal and for choosing to cultivate a mind that is truly unshakable.